Hey guys, welcome back to another video. 60's behind me here. I've pulled the diffs out. Tonight I'm gonna brace and straighten them, and I'm also changing the front radius arm setup to a flipped arm setup. So I've already gone ahead and modified the diff and put the arms in, so I'll sort of go through what's going on here. So this jig is our flipped arm jig that we use when we're modifying housings here at work to put our flipped arm kit in it. I've just used it to sort of hold the diff nice and square, and then I've had to obviously make up my own rear mounts there to suit sort of the long arm setup that I'm running. I basically set the diff at the correct height when I was in the chassis over there, checked caster. Caster was good because I set it all up on the computer beforehand. So then I just measured my angles. So when I put it in the diff here, in the jig here, the angles would remain the same. Then I drew in the computer some new arms and some new mounts to sort of weld onto the diff here itself. This time I've gone for 2 plates and a bit of 20x20 SHS in there for mock-up arms, because everyone was bullying me that came here to say that my arms wouldn't hold up to, you know, driving around, even though they're only for mock-up. But now that it's at the stage where hopefully I'll be able to push it soon, they were right. That, you know, the little bit of 6mm would have buckled. So hopefully this is enough to push the car around when I do have it done. All right, so first thing is, why did I go flipped arms, I suppose? Flipped arms in cruisers are a really good thing. The main reason is because under here, the arms go really low because they actually swing under the tie rod at the back here. Unlike a Nissan where they go over the tie rod like this, they go under the tie rod and have a really big dip, which is a really big rock hanger. And I've never had normal radius arms. I've always had flipped arms in my Hilux. So if I didn't do it in this and then, you know, I started wheeling it, and I got caught up on it often, I would hate the fact that, you know, I could have avoided it. Originally, I didn't do it because when I sort of drew it all on the computer and designed it, I had the diff going up as high as I could, and it was going to basically hit the chassis, so there was no room to run these guys. But once I put the cab on and worked out, you know, my maximum up travel for the wheels to not hit the guards, there ended up being a little bit of room. So I've modified this from our normal flipped arm sort of setup to maximize the clearance here. You'll see that the spacing is a bit weird. It's like really set back on the diff. That is obviously to get this little bush down as low as it can be without hitting the pan hard. And then on this side here, you'll see this is where the coilover mounts, and then this is my bypass shock. And they're still between the bolts, so that way the load of the car is still like sort of evenly distributed between the two bushes. Whereas when you have the coilover hanging off the back of the diff and you have one radius arm mount right there, and then you have one, you know, over here when they're underneath, the diff is always sort of loaded on this back bush because the weight of the car is sitting down on it. So now that they're balanced between, that should really help that. And the arms are the same left to right, rather than sort of like our flipped arms, one on this side is kicked around to sort of clear the pan hard and the other one is not. These are a mirror image. This side, I just ran into issues, this bloody bolt hitting this, because I haven't obviously on the computer got a scan with this GU front cover on it, so this was actually hitting. But I've cut the bolt down enough, I'll be able to run a nylock on there, and then if I shave a bit of the head off here, I can actually just slip it out. So problem solved. Not the best solution, but I couldn't come out this way because then it would hit my coilover. But, you know, we got it in there and it works. The knuckle gusset lines up nicely on the plating here, and that's basically it. The flipped arms are a great setup because you can see how nice and flat they are sort of sitting. This will be how it's set up at ride height, basically. And you can see how nice and flat they are, which means that they work in a really neutral sort of arc and they move basically up and down in like a nice swing. If you mount this, you know, down here or up here, the diff will still, you know, swing in the same spot, because it doesn't matter if the arm goes, you know, 2 meters up into the air, then back down. The diff is still swinging in the same position from that point to that point. But what it does do is help with these bushes when you articulate. These arms aren't sort of swinging backwards and forwards as much. They're just moving in the same sort of plane as each other. So they do help with loosening up the front end to provide a little bit more articulation, and we'll get a little bit more again by having a longer arm. So Friday Arvo, when I stayed back to start working on the flipped arm diff, one of the boys, Kev, stayed back as well to give me a hand. He pulled the rear diff out just here behind me and started to fit the brace kit and all the rear shock mounts and stuff. So he's not here tonight to sort of keep going on it, but that's making good progress. You can see he's got the truss tacked on, which is like a really nice big one-piece truss that we sort of cut and folded. It's incorporated. We'll put a tube sort of cut out here for the fill point. it's rolled sort of, it's not on the top and it's not on the back, it's on that sort of rear 45, because if you can imagine when I take a hit with the rear wheel, it's going to want to go, back, but also up. So that's directly along that sort of plane, while also sort of providing, a normal weight sort of support, and then also the rear back sort of hit. It's very similar to like what you'd get on like a sheet metal housing with like a brace for like one of the bigger sort of trophy truck or Ultra 4 cars. Looks cool. It's not super thick. It's only 3mm, but the way it's sort of designed and the overall height is where a lot of the strength will come into it. It has incorporated shock mounts, so this actually has to come back off so that they could be fully welded onto the housing, and then they'll get welded again here, so that way they're not just hanging off a bit of little 3mm just there. So when this is all done, we'll have the shock mounts sort of done on here on the bottom, ready to roll. This will all be braced, and then we'll go through straightening the diff as well. So basically any diff that we work on, especially like the front and rear diffs on this because they're getting so much welding, we'll have to straighten. There's not really any way to sort of get around that. So now that I've got the diff all tacked up, I'm going to throw it back under the car, jack it all the way up, make sure that my clearances do work and the arms don't, do something silly and hit the chassis heaps far before my shocks sort of fit or something. Then I'll be able to sort of work out my front bump stops, which I haven't got on this diff yet. I am running out of room. There's a lot of bracketry going on here. But once I get them tacked on, I can weld on the bracing, straighten it, and that's basically the front housing done. The only other little thing I need to do is, if you can see that down here, the little filler for the GU diff, I've got to raise it because the high pinion on the GU center apparently is really high, and I didn't realize that when I measured it compared to the rear center on a Patrol. So I'll throw this housing in now and check all this front end clearance and start working on the bump stops. Okay, so I'm back, and now that I've got the flipped arms done on the diff and the diff is back in at full height, you can see it's obviously hitting the chassis here, so we're going to go down just a little bit, which will be full up travel. And now I've got to set the bump stops. So for the bump stops, I'm going to be running a little solid rubber bump like this. This is like really firm, a hard stop. It's, I think, like a universal bump stop. I bought this from Road Safe. So these will go directly under the chassis, sort of, behind this where you can't see, up into the chassis like that. And then there'll be a little pad, just here, but on the other side, on the inside where you can't really see. You can probably see down in here though. He'll basically be sort of like there, which you can't really see, and then land on top of the diff. So that way, on those huge hits, all the load goes straight up into the chassis. As a secondary, more sort of gentle bump stop, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put some, you can get bump stops for on your coilovers. So you can see here on my Can-Am, there's one on the shaft. This is the coilover, and you can see there's that bump stop on the bottom of the shaft there. They're a bit squishier, and they're designed to sort of, well, that's the only bump stop that the Can-Am has. And on the front, there's one on here too. So I'm going to put them on my coilovers as like a more gentle sort of transitioning bump. And then for those massive hits that, you misjudge and there's nothing you can do about, this guy will sort of stop everything smashing itself to pieces because the load will go straight from the diff into the chassis rather than, ripping all my towers and stuff off. All right, so I'm just about to mount these bump stops to the chassis. I've made it up 2 of these little brackets here. So this will sit under the chassis, kind of like how I'm holding it now. This hole in the center, once I've got it tacked to the bottom of the chassis like that, I will drill through the bottom of the chassis as well, and I'll tap both sort of materials, the factory chassis and this bracket, and then I'll be able to screw this bump stop straight up into the bottom. So I've already got, you can see my mark here, so I've already got a line underneath the chassis on both sides here. So that's where the center of the hole will go, and this will just clip up like that, and I'll tack that on, and then once I'm done tacking, I'll get a drill, and I'll drill up through that hole into here as well, and then I'll run a tap through both. And then this little bump stop will just go straight up and on. All right, bump stops on. Okay, so Kev's finished welding out the truss. We've got the upper control arm and lower control arm brackets on there, and also the start of both our shock mounts. The only thing left to do is a bump stop pad here and a little sway bar bracket as well when we get to it. But now that it's all fully welded, we're gonna go through and straighten the housing like we will with the front when it's braced too. So Kev's got the bar in, and we've got a center bolted in here. And in the center, we've got the bearing carriers are replaced with pucks that have the exact same size hole as this bar. So this bar will slide through, go through the center in both sides, and that'll keep it perfectly true with the diff center where the axles would want to run. And then we can see in the end here how out it is, because the bar should come through perfectly centered. But if it's, you know, up against the top or the bottom, we know where the diff needs to be moved so that we can make sure it's nice and straight. Because we've done all the welding on the back side here, so we've done the top and the bottom underneath and then all these brackets, it's going to have pulled a bit. So Kev's got the bar. Do you want to throw it in, Kev? So at the moment, it's in one bearing?
It's in the first one.
Yeah, so then when he throws it in the second one, what happens? Did it just seat then?
Yeah, so it's stuck now.
So it's stuck now, and you can see, so it's sitting hard on this edge, and then there's like quite a large gap on this side. So that means the whole housing has pulled sort of up that way, which lines up with where we've just put this huge truss on. So we can't get it all the way through, but we imagine this side would be the same. On like a front diff, this opening is a bit bigger, so you can actually get it through usually a lot easier, and then you can see sort of how out it is, but these holes are actually really tiny. So now we'll put it on jig, pull it straight, and as we get it closer to being straighter, this bar will be able to go through further, and then we can just work it until it's perfect and the bar will slide through nice and straight. All right, so diff's all welded now. Kev's finished straightening it. And like I said before, we've got inside our center here, we've got two pucks that replace the bearings and our big shaft going through, and we've got a puck in each end of the diff now as well, which you can see here to ensure the diff is straight. And before, the bar didn't fit through, but now you can see it slides through easy. So now we know the diff's nice and straight, all the axle seals will be good, the wheels will track well, and it's ready to go back in the car. And then I can go through and put the shock mounts on the ends of these two brackets here that are sort of ready to accept it. And we've just got to also put a bump pad on top, which I'm not too worried about warping the diff because it'll be on top of this bracing and these two shock mounts rather than on the actual tube itself. And then we'll also need just a little sway bar linkage wherever he ends up, somewhere here probably. And that diff's ready to roll. So we were talking today at lunch about bracing diffs and how it's annoying that once you weld them, how they always warp and pull in different ways, and you have to straighten them afterwards to make sure your axle seals survive and, you know, the wheels run true. So I thought while we were doing the rear diff tonight, I would get a few bits of pipe here and I'll sort of run a weld down them in different ways that we see on the net that people sort of say how they weld up diff bracing. And we can do a bit of an experiment and see on which way works the best and if any of them keep the diff straight. We sort of all came up with our theories on what will or won't work best, but we'll give them a try here. It's obviously not going to be an exact replication because I'm just going to run a bead of weld down the tubes instead of, you know, having a diff housing and putting trusses on them. But the theory is when you run a weld down something, it gets really hot, and then as it cools, it contracts and will pull the material in the way that you just welded. So by welding a truss on top of a diff, once it cools, it'll pull the diff up and sort of create a bit of a banana. So I've got some bits here of pipe that I'll just tack to the bench, weld them, cut the tacks, and we'll see what happens. All right, so for the experiment, I've got 4 pipes here. This first one, I'm just going to do a solid weld from one end to the other so we can see how much it creates, you know, a bow in the tube if you just did one big weld. Then this next one here, I'm going to stitch it, just, you know, stitch, 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 then come back, stitch, stitch, stitch. Still sort of like reasonably quickly, but stitched rather than fully welded. And then this one I'm going to stitch over like an hour or so, just like as it cools down, I'll put another stitch here and there. Maybe I'll do one at each end or something, but I'll take my time on this one because that's the most common thing you hear is if you take your time, it won't bend, right? And then this is one that we've also sort of heard about, which preloading it before you weld it. So I don't know if you can see that, but I've got 6 mil jammed underneath here and then I've clamped it down at this end and tacked it. So it's already bent this way. But the theory makes sense that then when you make a banana, it actually ends up straight because it's already bent. So we'll give this a crack. I'll weld it up and I'll get a few videos and we'll see what the end result is. I'll cut all these tacks on the bottom here and see how much they go bwang, and we'll have an answer. All right, so I just finished welding the last pipe onto the bench. I thought I'd get a cool shot of cutting the tacks and watching them all sort of go pwang as they come up off the bench. But unfortunately, while welding them, every single one actually broke one of the welds and popped at random times. So I didn't get that on video, unfortunately, but I'll show you them now. Each pipe bent pretty bad. This is the one that I did in one pass, which is pretty bent. This one I stitched in like a normal sort of, amount of time, which also is pretty bent, nearly as bent as this guy. This is the one I welded over like an hour or two, and it's still pretty bent. And then this is the one that I preloaded. I had the center stacked up 6mm with packers, and it's bent too. It's the least bent, but it's still bent a lot when you consider that it was, pre-bent the other way. So I'll get a straight edge out now, and we'll run an edge and measure the gap, and we'll see what the difference is. All right, here's the first one, and it is pretty bent. This is the one I welded in one pass. So it's got a height of 10.5mm. So now we'll get the one I stitched. All right, so here's the one that we stitched welded in like, 15 minutes or so, whatever. 10mm on the dot. All right, so this is number 3. This is the one I welded over like 2 hours in stitch welding. And it is basically the same, 9.8mm. So 0.2 less than the one I stitched in about 15 minutes and 0.7mm less than the one I just welded in one go. Yeah, so this is the last one. This is the one I had a 6mm packer right here in the center, and both ends were clamped down and then tacked to the bench. So it was actually bananaed the other way, and it's bent too, and it is 6.2. So 3mm less than the others. And it was a complete guess how much bow to put in it, and like if we were welding a truss on a diff, that would be a complete gamble because you don't know how much you're bending it. And then if we're only going to weld a truss on this section here, do we put the jack here? Or like, are we bowing the whole thing over a period, or are we only doing it where we're welding? So it's not really a super accurate measurement. But that goes to show, I guess, that, it doesn't matter what you do, they're all going to move. And it was all pretty similar really in the scheme of things. But it moved a lot. Like they're only 900mm long tubes and it moved 10mm, so that's a fair bit. All right guys, so back in the shop tonight. Last night I finished welding out the front housing. I've just got 2 little things left to do to it. I forgot to record anything. I had the camera set up, but I just didn't press record before I did it. So the diff's fully welded now. The diff's all welded out. All the brackets are on, trusses on both sides. I've put my landing pads here for the bump stops on both sides. So they're good to go. Now all I've got to do is I've just got to raise this up. So I'm just going to cut a rectangle here and flip it. So this goes from here up to here. So it's a bit higher fill point for the high pinion center. And then I've just got to put a bit of armor on here. I'm not going to put like a real big bulky armor on there just because I don't really think it's needed. I didn't have any armor on the front diff on my Hilux, which I wheeled pretty hard for over 10 years and, never sort of messed with it. So I'm just going to I've made up this little bracket. I'm just going to weld him along there and just hammer that around so it like follows the radius nice. Just to protect the crown wheel where it's real close there. So if you do hit that, it doesn't dent. But I think, just in the interest of keeping the diff as light as possible, there's no need to put like a huge sort of frame over the whole top of that. So I'll knock them out now, and then this diff's ready to be cleaned up and straightened as well, and she's done. All right, so I've just cut this rectangle out, and the idea being, ouch, hot. Okay, so just cut this rectangle out. It used to sit in there like that. The idea now is if I just flip it around like this and put it back in, we've raised the filler plug. So I'll just clean that up with, I'll just clean up the edges for paint, you know, all the way around there, clean all that up, clean up this guy. In hindsight, I probably should have done that while it was all one piece, would have been easier. And then I'll weld it back in. I'll weld this on while I'm going. Diff's done. Alright, so diff's all cleaned up. So first thing I did was I just went along with my cold chisel, knocked off any sort of loose spatter. Then I gave it a quick hit with my flappy disc on sort of like, you know, getting onto the little nooks and crannies that I could to clean up as best I could. And then I grabbed a flat sanding disc like this. If you're not familiar with these, this pad goes on a grinder and these flat sanding discs go on there, and then, you know, this nut goes inside the center there onto your grinder, and that's how you get like a real nice flat surface. So it's really good for like what I've done here, where you've got to blend this out. You can see that's basically, you know, seamless now, and that's really how you get it. With one of these, it stops you sort of like creating real groovy sort of grind marks, because this whole surface, you know, hits instead of a flappy disc just digging in. And then once I'm done, I just go through with the orbital sander and give it a little hit, and that takes off sort of the grains that the grinder would otherwise leave behind. So this has all been orbital sanded, and like you can see, it's quite like a matte sort of finish. Whereas if I roll it over, so you can see there, like I haven't done this side yet, and you can see sort of all the grind marks in the metal there, like this here, where the grinder's been a bit rough on it. But then if I hit it with this, it really sort of softens all those marks up. They might still be there, but it takes just a tiny bit off without taking too much metal off, and really softens it up. And that way, once you paint or powder coat it, it really blends in nice, and you don't end up with those sort of real rough grind marks in it. So now I've just got to go through and do this side, and we can call that job done. All right, so just finished off welding up the front diff. It's ready to be straightened. So now I've just brought the welder over to the chassis, and I'm just going to put a bit of weld on the front shock towers and stuff, because next time I put the front diff under it, I'm going to be able to bolt the coilovers in, put some springs on it, and sit it on its own weight. So I'll just put a bit of weld on here so that, you know, everything doesn't just break off, and then I can move on to doing the rear shocks, and before you know it, it'll be a roller. All right guys, so front diff's in the jig, ready to be straightened. I just threw the rear diff in, ready to start on the shock mounts. If you've got any questions about what you've seen tonight, you know, whether it be straightening diffs, bracing them, flipped arms, you know, whatever, leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, thanks for your support, and I'll see you on the next video.